All right, this lecture is about advanced risk assessment. And this is, I enjoy doing this. The first version of this I did 2 years ago at the Georgetown Debate Seminar in 2011. And the kind of genre of this lecture is one that I like doing, which is to think about things in debate that have become rote or routine, self-evident, and then has kind of grown out of my skepticism of those things. I think that being skeptical of the way everyone does things is very powerful and gives you an opportunity to innovate. And I think it challenges debate to stop being so stagnant. And I think impact comparison, impact calculus is a place where debate is very stagnant and where there is a wide opportunity for debaters to advance the depth with which we compare impacts, and in particular to think differently about the comparison of impacts. I think that this is a useful lecture regardless of the kind of argument that you like to go for. So I know that there are several people in here whose names I recognize as people who really like critique arguments. There are several people whose names I recognize as really like politics, DAs, and policy arguments. And this is not a lecture for either group. It is a lecture about, in many ways, how to think about risk in a way that makes sense of all of those arguments and in a way that deepens our understanding of decisions and how to make decisions in a complex world. The format of the lecture is fourfold. There are 4 Roman numerals, 4 subdivisions, and I will preview them now to help with your flowing. Number 1 is the traditional model of risk assessment in debate. The traditional model of risk assessment in debate. Number 2, problems with the traditional model of risk assessment in debate. Problems with the traditional model of risk assessment in debate. Number 3, alternatives and alternative models of risk assessment. And number 4, application of advanced risk assessment in debate. I think the last section provides a lot of practical tips about how to incorporate some of this into your debating, but I would encourage you not to limit your thinking to only those tips that I provide, but to use the first section, the second section, the third section of this lecture to think, and as a prompt to think about the way that risk is evaluated, about different ways that risk could be evaluated and analyzed. And I'm confident that many of you will come up with new creative ways to express arguments about risk in debate. So don't only think of this as here's what to do. That's kind of the whole point of this is I don't think that there's any one right way to do it. I think there are many ways to do it, and I encourage you to think about that. So Roman numeral 1, the traditional model of risk assessment in debate. Subpoint A, or number 1, I guess I did number 1, is a discussion of terminology. It is my strong belief that the terminology we use to discuss risk assessment is important. The terminology we use to discuss risk assessment is important. I think it shapes the way we, and in this we, I'm thinking of debaters and debate people, the way we debaters think about risk assessment. And I think it frames the way judges understand and think about risk assessment. So the terminology matters. The terminology that got me thinking about this, and which I don't like, is impact calculus. And I used to be more ideological about this, and I would just say, stop saying impact calculus. But that was ineffective. My criticism is that it involves too much of a mathematical understanding of impact, and it suggests that there's a right answer to how much impact there is, and that comparisons between impacts are self-evident. It's like calculus. As long as you get the inputs right, the equation will plug out which impact is bigger. I have softened from that stance and no longer immediately think that impact calculus is a silly term, because I have sort of reconceptualized or reappropriated the term impact calculus, and I did so as follows. If you look up the definition of calculus and you divorce it from calculus in math, the kind of general definition of calculus, and this is what people would say, they would say, well, Batterman, calculus doesn't just mean math. It means a particular method or system of calculation or reasoning. Particular system or method of calculation or reasoning. So I thought to myself, what does calculation mean? Does that have to be mathematical? And no. The dictionary definition that I like best is an assessment of the risks, possibilities, or effects of a situation or course of action. So a calculation is an assessment of the risks, possibilities, or effects of a situation or course of action. I like that. Gets me back to what I really kind of think this should be about, which is about risk. So I thought, well, what does risk mean? What is the definition of risk? The dictionary says it's the possibility of suffering harm or loss. It's danger. Or it's a factor, thing, element, or course involving uncertain danger, a hazard. And when thought about in that way, impact calculus is risk assessment. It is risk comparison. What we do when we make decisions in debate is we assume a particular position, we assume a particular decision-making context, and we don't know the outcome of the decisions that we make. We don't know what will happen for sure if we choose option A or option B or option C. But we nonetheless attempt to make the best decision by predicting and evaluating the risks involved. And so I really enjoy the term risk assessment, or the term risk comparison, because it implies and sort of appreciates or understands that risk and danger is everywhere always, and that what we are doing is comparing relative risks, not simply calculating, not simply plugging into an equation. It fits with my general theme about things in debate, which is it's complicated. It's not that simple. We should be more nuanced in our thinking. We should appreciate context. We should compare. Number two, the way risk is usually debated. So most of you, having come up in debate, would say that the way to calculate risk is to multiply probability and magnitude. So probability times magnitude equals impact. And if it's close, break the tie with time frame. It's kind of what we teach students as they begin their journey in debate. And that has constructed what I would call the holy trinity of impact jargon. And young students, many instructors, teach them that they must use these three words in every overview: magnitude, probability, impact. And even those who aren't quite as faithful to the Trinity believe that those are important words and that those are the words that must be used in debate. If you haven't used those words, you haven't compared impacts. So, boom. Magnitude means the size of the impact. How bad is it? How big is it? Probability means the likelihood of the impact. How likely is it to happen? Time frame is what I would call the event horizon. When is it going to happen? When is it likely to happen? I assume you all know that, but I think it's important to think about what those things mean. This model, this holy trinity of impact jargon, is not neutral and it is not objective. It was constructed by debaters and debate coaches as a tool to simplify the difficult task of comparing risks. And I think too many people don't understand or appreciate this. Debate coaches didn't unearth or discover this holy trinity of impact jargon. They made it. And I understand why they made it. Because it is so simple, it's very useful for training young, novice-level debaters, beginners, to better conceptualize impacts. It does matter how big the impact is. It matters how likely that impact is. And it matters when the impact happens, obviously. How could you argue with this, Batterman? It's obvious. It also survives because it's become very safe. You can't go wrong if you stick to the script. You won't stand out if you just rehash the same old tired scripts about magnitude and probability and time frame. But most problematically, it has become an excuse and an easy way to avoid making arguments. The purpose of jargon is to simplify communication. It's supposed to allow us to make arguments more efficiently, so that we're kind of on the same page. We can more quickly communicate a concept that we kind of are all familiar with. But too many times, the holy trinity of impact comparison, or of impact calculus, replaces argument. It inhibits instead of enhances effective communication. And I think for students that are seeking not just to develop a novice level of impact comparison, but to go beyond that and to better connect their arguments in debate to the arguments that they research, and to better connect the decision-making process in debate to the decision-making process that we all undertake every day of our lives, we need a better vocabulary, because this vocabulary limits us and it forces you all to fit square pegs into round or triangular holes. Roman numeral 2. Problems with the traditional model of risk assessment and debate. Number 1, it oversimplifies. We all intuitively understand before we come to debate, and hopefully during and after we have been debaters, despite being brainwashed that this is how you think about impacts, that there is more to decisions than magnitude and probability. When I decided to come give these elective lectures this afternoon, I didn't calculate the magnitude and probability of the advantages and disadvantages of doing so. I did not multiply the chance that I would be injured on my way here times the impact magnitude of that injury, thus arriving at some calculated number. And I didn't calculate the magnitude of learning I expected you all to achieve. And I didn't calculate the probability that you would learn those things and then compare those two in a mathematical equation. There are many cards in this lecture, and the first one is here, and it's from Peter Sandman, wonderful name, who specializes in risk. And he says the following: as traditionally defined, risk is the product of two factors, magnitude multiplied by probability. In mathematics, it doesn't matter whether you multiply a big number by a small number or a small number by a big number. You get the same answer. Mathematically, high magnitude, low probability risks and low magnitude, high probability risks are equivalent. Consider a technology that has 1 chance in a million of killing 10 million people. The expected number of deaths from this technology is 10. It has the same risk as another technology with 1 chance in 1,000 of killing 10,000 people, or a technology with 1 chance in 10 of killing 100 people, or one that's absolutely certain to kill 10 people. They all have an expected mortality of 10. From a technical perspective, they are equal risks. If you think like a mathematician, you are equally concerned about a 1 in a million chance of killing 10 million people and the sure death of 10 people. But no one, not even mathematicians, thinks like a mathematician. Normal people figure a technology with 1 chance in a million of killing 10 million people will probably kill nobody, but just might kill 10 million people. The number 10 has nothing to do with it. Good point, Mr. Sandman. Let me provide another simple example. Let's say that we were choosing between a variety of options. You have the following 4 options. And I want you to think, like, make note of these, and I'm going to poll the audience and decide which one people would choose. And then we'll work through it a little bit. Option 1. 100% chance, I don't know why I pronounced that weird, 100% chance 5 people die. That's your first option. We'll call that option A. Option B, 50% chance 10 people die. That's option B. Option C, 25% chance 20 people die. That's option C. Option D, 1% chance 500 people die. Everybody got all the options? Okay. Think for a second. I'll give you a moment here. I'll give you 30 seconds to think about it. I want you to really think about it. You're in a position where you need to make this decision, and these are your 4 options. Think about which one you're going to pick.
Wait, I'm thinking the one we would least likely want to happen.
Pick the choice you're making.
Like
You have to pick one of these options.
Okay.
Yep, the one you want to do.
The one we want to prevent, or the one we
What do you want to pick? You have to pick one of these options. You're taking one of these options. I spilled in my glasses and I can't see anyone. And someone has a question. Yes, sir.
Is this like making a decision between a product that people will use in their daily lives, or like a miracle cure, something that only has at one time?
No, there's no trick to it. These are the options in front of you. You have to pick one. No trick. Sometimes you got to make a hard choice. All right, who would pick option A? You take option A 100% of the time, 5 people will die. Don't look around, just raise your hand.
Okay, like that's like the best option?
The one that you will take, yep.
Which one is this?
Think that, all right, Karthik is in the back of the room. You all seem to be having trouble with something that is very simple. Let's say that Karthik needs to make this decision. You're advising Karthik, and you say, Karthik, pick option 1, pick option A, pick option B, pick option C, pick option D, but he's got to pick one of them. And so you're telling him, all right, Karthik, pick option A. Who would say, Karthik, pick option A? This is your best choice. Okay? Who would say, pick option B? Option B is your best choice. Okay? Who would say, pick option C? It's your best choice. Okay? Who would say, pick option D? That's your best choice. Okay? This is interesting because when we multiply probability and magnitude, the expected death in each situation is 5. Okay? If we do impact calculus, if we multiply probability and magnitude, you could not make a decision. But you all did. And we'll return to how you made that decision in a moment. But think about it. All of these options that Karthik has that he could take give him an expected outcome of 5 people dying. In the first one, every time he chooses this option, 5 people will die. Every time. If he does it now, 5 people die. He does it tomorrow, 5 people die. He does it the next day, 5 people die. Every time, 5 people die. None of the time, anything else. In the second option, half of the time that he chooses that option, 10 people will die. And half of the time that he chooses that option, 0 people will die. Okay, so half the time, that one appeals to me. I think Jake liked that one. Half the time, nobody dies. That would be good. No one would die. Half the time, 10 people die. Ooh. Hope it's the 50% where no one dies. In the third one, 25% of the time, so 1/4 of the time, 100 people are going to die. Chooses option C. He tries it 4 times. 1 out of those 4 times, 100 people are going to die. But 75% of the time, 3 out of 4 times, nobody's going to die. That would be nice. Hopefully, it's one of those 3 out of 4, right? The last option, the one that you all preferred, overwhelmingly it seemed like, 1% of the time, so 1 time out of 100, Karthik picks that option, and 1,000,000 people are dead. You know how many people 1,000,000 people is? That's a lot of people. But 99 times out of 100, no people are dead. So if he does it 100 times, 99% of the time, no deaths. 1% of the time, 1,000,000 people are dead. How did you pick which one to choose? Think about it. Think to yourself. I don't want you to tell everyone else yet, but I want you to think. How did you make that decision? How did you decide which risk to take? How did you decide which option to choose? How did you differentiate between these options? We intuitively know that there are differences between relative risks that are not described or expressed through the traditional debate model of impact comparison. And the language of magnitude and probability doesn't allow us, or doesn't provide us with the vocabulary we need to express our risk preferences. It doesn't give us a chance to express our arguments about relative risk. It is too simple. It oversimplifies. Number 2, it doesn't contextualize. doesn't contextualize. Policy decisions are not mathematical equations, and they don't have inputs that are precise enough to do cut and dry calculations. And I think we all kind of know that. That doesn't mean that it's useless to consider probability and magnitude. Both of those are really important, and we're going to talk about that momentarily. But it's important to understand that risk assessment, when talking about policies or talking about ideologies to adopt, or just any important decision that we have to make about the world and about a complicated, complex world, demands something a little bit more sophisticated. Second card from Jakob Hertzberger, who we'll talk about who he is in a few minutes. Risk is a complex phenomenon with multiple attributes. This has distinct effects on the way decision makers compare risks, on the biases that affect risk perceptions, and on decision makers' risk preferences. To explain these effects requires two concepts: the texture of risk and the taste for risk. Comparing risks is an essential task in choosing among policy options. The most obvious approach is to compare the magnitude of risk represented by the competing options. But real-life political strategic contexts are mostly ill-defined and contain hard-to-quantify variables. Decision makers rely, therefore, on a more complex and differentiated comparison based on the texture of risk. Hertzberger introduces two components. The first component he introduces is the taste for risk. The taste for risk. Metaphor about appetite. How much appetite does the decision maker have for risk? Is the decision maker risk averse? Risk avoiding? Another way to say that? Is the decision maker risk neutral? Is the decision maker risk loving or risk seeking? The taste for risk is a normative question. It's a question about how much risk appetite a decision maker should have. What risks should the decision maker accept, and which risks should the decision maker reject? Sneak preview. It's something you can debate about. Second is the texture of risk. The texture of risk. That means, what are the attributes that define the risk? What makes up the risk? And there's a lot more to it than just magnitude and probability. And we will have plenty more about this later. A lot of teasers. Roman numeral 3. Alternative models of risk assessment. Alternative models of risk assessment. So we've got our debate model. We've got the traditional debate model. Just sort of grounded in mathematics. It's grounded in the pragmatics of having to teach young people how to debate. It's kind of, it's evolved over time, but it's just sort of a historical thing. Debate coaches have come up with a good way to assess risk. I just don't think it's the best way. The first alternative model is the Bostrom model. Bostrom model. You've probably read cards from this individual, Nick Bostrom. Probably heard of him before. He is an academic who teaches at the University of Oxford and specializes in risk analysis and risk assessment, and in particular, existential risk assessment. And his most amazing achievement is he won the 2009 Eugene R. Gannon Award for the continued pursuit of human advancement. And if you ever have a lab with Seth, ask him about it. How many people know what I'm talking about? Those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, you know Mr. Gannon, Seth Gannon, Andreas Gannon. If you see Seth Gannon, if you're in his lab or you're in a lecture with him, just be like, "Hey, Mr. Gannon, you know anything about Nick Bostrom?" I don't want to give it away. Bostrom says the following. It's right there in the name, Eugene R. Gannon. I wonder what Seth's first name is. Before we can determine the seriousness of a risk, we must specify a means of evaluation by which the negative value of a particular possible loss scenario is measured. Complicated way of saying we got to know, we have to have a method to our madness of calculating risks. He says, we can roughly characterize a risk's seriousness using 3 variables. Scope, which is the size of the population at risk. Severity, which is how badly this population would be affected. And probability, which is how likely the disaster is to occur according to our best judgment given currently available evidence. Scope, severity, probability. He continues. The scope of a risk can be personal, affecting only one person, local, affecting some geographical region or a distinct group, global, affecting the entire human population or a large part thereof, or transgenerational, affecting all of or a large part of humanity for all time to come. The intensity or severity of a risk can be classified as imperceptible, which means barely noticeable, endurable, which means causing significant harm but not completely ruining quality of life, or crushing, causing death or a permanent and drastic reduction of quality of life. That's Bostrom's model. The Bostrom model is pretty similar to the traditional debate model. It's not that much different. The major difference is that Bostrom splits the concept of magnitude into 2. First part is scope, the size of the population at risk. And he says that a good way to think about that is using the 4 scopes: personal, local, global, transgenerational. We're going to think about scope, the size of the population at risk. And then the second part is severity or intensity. He kind of uses both words interchangeably. And that's how badly this population that we're talking about would be affected. How bad is it for those people, for that population? And again, he suggests a vocabulary for talking about that. He says it can be imperceptible, it can be endurable, it can be crushing. And so without much effort, we could port that into debate. And we could split magnitude. We could get rid of the language of magnitude, and we could start talking about scope. We could start talking about intensity, and we can keep talking about probabilities. That's easy. It wouldn't take that much effort to change. Boy, wouldn't that allow us to talk about impacts in a little bit of a different way? There might be endurable but bad impacts that are global in scope, and they might be more important than a crushing impact that is regional or local. There might be a transgenerational impact that's endurable and a global impact that's crushing. Which one do we care more about? Do we care about the really long-term impact that affects everyone for a long time, like warming? Or do we care about the global impact that would be crushing on a certain population, like a big war? Magnitude doesn't allow us to do that comparison. Or it does, but it gets in the way. Bostrom's model can help. Number 2, the Würzburger model. Würzburger. I think that's how you pronounce it. Oh, it's really long. It's not that complicated though. Wurz, V-E-R-T-Z, Berger, B-E-R-G-E-R. Just one word. First name is Yaakov, Y-A-A-C-O-V. He is a professor of international relations at a university in Israel called the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And he specializes in decision-making and risk. And in particular, how policymakers assess risk. And I don't totally remember how I found this book, but he wrote a book called Risk-Taking and Decision-Making, Foreign Military Intervention Decisions. And I don't encourage you to read it, because I basically distilled the parts that are useful for debaters and I'm now telling them to you. But if you're like, boy, I would love to read some Yaakov Würzburger, go for it. And I don't remember totally how I came across this, but I remember that the chapter that I read that's awesome is called The Anatomy of Risk, What is Risk and How is it Framed? And I was sitting right over there, actually, a couple of years ago when I first read this. We had a lab room down here somewhere in the ICC, and I was sitting on one of those very uncomfortable benches that's over, up against that wall. And I remember it vividly. I had this book, and I don't remember why I was just sitting there. I think I was waiting on someone to do a redo or something. And I was reading this chapter, and I was like, wow, this is really cool, and this is really useful for debate. Here's his basic model, and we're going to hear more from him in a few minutes to clarify. He says, the level of risk from the decision maker's vantage point will be defined by the answers to the following questions. Number 1, what are the gains and losses associated with each known outcome? Number 2, what is the probability of each outcome? Number 3, how valid are the outcome probabilities and gain-loss estimates? Risk, he says, is the likelihood that validly predictable direct and indirect consequences with potentially adverse values will materialize arising from particular events. We'll unpack that shortly. Accordingly, he says, risk estimates have 3 dimensions: outcome values, the probability of outcomes, and the validity attributed to the estimates of both of those, of outcome values and probabilities. So let's unpack that. Würzburger is more different from the traditional debate model than Bostrom. He replaces magnitude and the whole idea of what we would consider impact comparison with one concept, and that concept is outcome values. That is, what are the possible outcomes? So we're here, there's a decision in front of us that we need to make. What are the possible outcomes of that? It maintains probability, but it distinguishes between probability and magnitude. Probability is part of outcome values, but then there's also the next question of how likely is each outcome? Not how likely is it that nuclear war causes extinction, but how likely is it that we even begin that scenario that results in nuclear war and potentially causing extinction? And then it introduces even a third dimension, which is how confident or how valid are the projections that we are making, both about the nature of the outcome, how bad it would be or how good it would be, and about the probability that that's what happens. And for some of you, it's like, yeah, that makes sense. For some of you, they're like, I don't get it. Can't I multiply? I think it makes intuitive sense, and it makes intuitive sense for a reason. Würzburg says the following. Information is often very vague or ambiguous. In making value and probability estimates, decision makers require a certain threshold of confidence before they will consider a risk worth worrying about. As confidence in outcome estimates increases, so does the perception of risk. And when confidence declines, so does risk perception. This correlation implies that similar value and probability estimates may result in dissimilar overall risk perceptions, because probability and value estimates may be held with dissimilar levels of confidence in their validity. Which is a really fancy way of saying you don't multiply probability by magnitude, you use probability to assess the relative risk of different magnitude outcomes. You need to think about how confident you are that each stage of your risk assessment is accurate or valid. How certain are we of our assessment of the scope of this possible outcome? How certain are we of our assessment of the severity of this possible outcome? How certain are we of our assessment of the probability of this outcome? The reason that I thought this was powerful, and the reason that I still think this is powerful, is that it exposes a failure of the traditional debate model, which is that the language of probability serves double duty. Probability is used both to mean how probable is the chain of events that culminates in the impact, and how probable is the impact if the chain of events occurs. But those are different questions. And the language and the vocabulary, the conception of risk that we kind of all use, I think misses some of that. When we say our impact is very probable because if there was a nuclear war, it would be likely that China or Russia would retaliate, therefore escalating to nuclear war, we have not actually discussed how probable it is that a chain of events would occur culminating in nuclear war. And when we talk about that chain of events culminating in nuclear war and how probable that is, we don't think about the probability of the terminal impact occurring and how that terminal impact may or may not escalate into something larger. assessments of confidence in prediction apply both to the impact and to its probability. It's a third dimension. And I think it was borne out by the way that you all assessed the risks and the options that Karthik had a few minutes ago. Some of you had so little confidence in the probability estimate that one time out of a million, or one time out of whatever, a million people would die, that you just discounted it. You were fine accepting that risk. Many people make that intuitive judgment. Others of you had no confidence in the probability assessment in the other way. You thought, well, you know, one time out of that many times we might kill a million people. What if we were wrong about our projection of that probability? Let's not take the risk. Let's just kill the 5 people. Safer. But the point is, relative confidence in the kind of things that make up impact calculus are really important. And because they are important, they are debatable. And in fact, should be debated. So how do we do that? The big section. Roman numeral 4. Application of advanced risk assessment in debate. So I believe that some of the problems with traditional impact calculus presents an opportunity both for critical debaters, policy debaters, I don't really like that divide, but people extending those different kinds of arguments to innovate and to develop better impact arguments, better risk arguments that better persuade judges to vote for them. It is my strong belief that students who are only capable of using the vocabulary of the holy trinity of impact calculus are vulnerable to sophisticated responses. And I have seen that happen, both with students who have used some of the stuff that I am teaching you today, as well as students who criticize risk in other ways. Usually critique teams, or teams that are reading critique arguments that challenge traditional risk conception notions. I think there's vulnerability there, so it's in your strategic interest to play with this. I also think that judges are hungry for more sophisticated comparisons. Many judges are tired of the stale repetition of the Holy Trinity. We hear that in every debate and have for years, and years, and years, and years, and years. Certainly there are some judges who are just comfortable with that and would prefer that you use that language, but I think even those judges will find well-articulated and innovative approaches to risk assessment enjoyable to listen to, challenging, exciting, and therefore worthy of more attention, more attentiveness during debates, and better speaker points, etc. So, number 1, debate the taste for risk. Debate the taste for risk. Würzburger explains this concept of an appetite for risk. It's basically how much risk you're willing to take. And each individual has a different appetite for risk. Some of you are very big risk takers. Some of you, you'll skateboard and you'll ride a motorcycle and you'll do all sorts of things that are kind of more dangerous behaviors. You love the excitement of those activities and you're willing to take some more risk than a risk neutral person or kind of a risk in the middle kind of person would. Others of you are very risk averse. You don't want to take any risks. You don't like putting yourself out there. You don't like gambling. You don't like doing things which pose a danger, even a small danger, because you don't like that feeling. You don't like the feeling of being at risk. There is no right appetite for risk. There is no correct answer to the question, how much appetite ought one have for risk? But there are a variety of opinions, and those opinions can be debated. And so your job as a debater is to explicitly shape the judge's appetite for risk. And to use rebuttal overviews in particular, but this begins in the constructives, to frame the debate in terms of the judge's appetite for risk, or taste for risk. One of my favorite Würzburger cards, and these aren't really cards that one could ever read in a debate, but they are lovely for sharing information with you all, is this. Problems do not often have single, obvious, self-explanatory boundaries, structures, and forms. It is the analyst who, in framing the problem, imposes boundaries, structures, and forms which convey a particular truth, but not the only truth. if all risk messages accurately reflected available knowledge, they would still engender intense conflict because there are different ways to tell the same truth that create different impressions on the audience. Messages do more than simply convey information. They highlight whatever information they present, drawing attention away from other aspects of the issue at hand, and they give meaning to knowledge, or give meaning to information. Because a risk message highlights information, it is less a mirror of scientific knowledge than a telescope. It makes the knowledge much clearer, but we see only part of it. Because it gives meaning, it provides less a photograph of reality than a portrait or sometimes a caricature. I love this. All about this. Got excited. Overviews in debate serve the same function that Würzburger is talking about. And you can just steal all of this, and it's awesome, and it's amazing. If you think like this, you'll be such a better debater. Good overviews telescope parts of the debate that the team wants to highlight, establishing a hierarchy of importance among different arguments. They telescope part of the debate. They make the judge look close up on that part of the debate. When I'm looking close up over here at Charlie, I can't really see Karthik, and I can sort of see Jake. He's like kind of over there, but I can sort of see Jay. I can't see anyone on this side of the room. That's the part of the debate that I'm focused on. I've telescoped at it. Good overviews also paint a portrait of the debate that presents their vision for the preferred outcome, them winning, based on the details that were introduced and developed during the round. You're painting a picture. You hear that all the time. Paint a picture. Tell a story in your final rebuttals. Würzburger uses the language of portrait. It's not a photograph. It's a portrait. It's an interpretation of all of the details. You see a photograph of the Washington Monument, it's like, wow, that looks really cool. And then you see a portrait, and it's someone's interpretation. They take certain details, and they kind of tweak them a little bit. They highlight the shadow, or they highlight the sunset behind. They take details, and they it's still the Washington Monument, but it's a portrait. It's a perspective on the Washington Monument. It's still the debate round. It's still the details that happened in the debate round, but it's a perspective on the things that have happened in the debate round. It's not just reminding the judge things that have happened in the round. It's kind of massaging those things and deciding which ones to highlight and which ones to not, and how to frame different things, drawing attention to some and taking attention away from others. Bad overviews resemble caricatures because they exaggerate, or they aren't consistent with what has happened during the course of the debate. They go too far in the direction of pretending that everything is different. It's like if Picasso did the Washington Monument and all of a sudden it was a circle. And it was surrounded by dragons or something. Like, well, that's one take on the Washington Monument, but that's not, I'm not buying that. No, that's not what it looks like. Because overviews serve these functions, you should use your overview in these ways to shape the judge's appetite for risk and to shape the judge's assessment of the risks in the debate. You should frame your overview statements in the language of comparative risks. In the language of comparative risks. This is a huge point of emphasis for students in our lab. So those of you that are from our lab, this is all stuff that you've been told millions of times and will continue to be told millions of times. Use plain language about the policy question at hand, about the actual thing that will happen, not debate jargon when framing risks. It's really hard to make a decision about risk when the risk that you are deciding about is couched entirely in debate jargon. It doesn't make intuitive sense as a judge. It divorces the details of the debate from the big picture. And it deprives the students, it deprives the final rebuttalist of an opportunity to shape the way that the judge thinks about the risks involved. Argue that certain risks are acceptable in light of even more pressing risks. The risk of their impact is justified to avoid our impact. The risk of our impact is too much to justify their impact. anyone from this debate. I copied in a couple of overviews. I think these are from Danko and someone. I don't remember who the other team was. Eileen and Colin, maybe? Is that who it was? Here's some examples. So let's say that the debate is about the comprehensive immigration reform disad, and there's an economy impact. And then there's a case advantage where you go into the relations advantage and you got the resource wars impact. Okay, pretty simple, right? You could say the risk of the disad outweighs the case. Economic decline is higher magnitude, it's more probable, it would happen faster, and it turns resource wars. Or when you're affirmative, you could say resource wars outweighs the disad, resource wars are bigger than economic decline because they involve China, whereas economic decline does not, and that turns economic decline because there's a resource war, we lose the economy, blah, blah, blah. It's jargon, garbage. Or we could say, if we were negative, without comprehensive immigration reform, the United States faces debilitating shortages of the high-skilled workers that drive its economic growth and prevent a double-dip recession. Engaging Cuba over oil development might reduce the chance of a U.S.-Sino clash over scarce energy resources, but this risk is justified in order to ensure passage of immigration reform and stave off economic decline. By framing the debate like that, you have already given the judge a context for making the decision. You have highlighted the relative importance of the two competing impacts, and you have contextualized the choice the judge needs to make in a way that makes it easy for them to appreciate and latch on to your explanation. Another way to do it, if you're affirmative. Engaging Cuba over oil development will stave off an otherwise inevitable resource conflict between the United States and China. The modest risk that engagement derails comprehensive immigration reform and weakens long-term economic growth is justified in order to prevent catastrophic war with China. Think of all the things that I have accomplished in those two sentences. I have contextualized the debate. I have distilled the debate to a single nexus question. I have suggested already, before even making arguments, that the risk associated with the disad is modest, that the impact that my side is trying to claim is catastrophic, that it's inevitable, and I've done all of that without relying on garbage debate words. Cool. Next thing you can do, you can read evidence to shape the judge's risk appetite. You can read evidence to shape the judge's risk appetite. It is warm in here. Bostrom cards, some of you have already read Bostrom cards, so like the most common one is the one from 2002 that says the United States and Russia that would be an existential war. He has later suggested that that is in fact not going to be an existential war, but that doesn't matter. The point is you can read evidence from experts in risk assessment that describe why the risk that you are defending is bigger than the risk that they are defending, or that just speak abstractly to how decision makers should approach risk, how much taste for risk they should have, what their appetite for risk should be. The reason that you should listen to risk experts is that judges like cards, obviously. And it makes sense in this context because those people who are experts in risk assessment are better at predicting risks, or they are at least better at contextualizing a baseline for making risk comparisons than debaters are. Card from a different Bostrom, who is unrelated to Nick. Despite the numerous value judgments and biases that can influence expert risk assessments, such assessments are nevertheless based on specialized information the average layperson is unlikely to know or have the resources to acquire. Knowledge about relative frequencies, causal mechanisms, and information sources often enables experts to make predictions about risky processes that are much more reliable than uninformed judgments. Most of us would rather not try to do for ourselves the jobs we usually delegate to experts, such as nuclear engineers, doctors, auto mechanics, or even lawyers. I read that card for two reasons. Both because I think the argument that the evidence makes is true and should encourage you to research scholarly arguments about relative risks. So to research the question of whether global warming is a more important priority than protecting biodiversity in the short term, or whether war is the biggest threat, or whether poverty is the biggest threat, or whatever. But also because I think this piece of evidence by itself can help advance the judge's understanding and taste for risk. Because this card would suggest to the judge that the judge should have an appetite for risk that's dependent on expert judgment. If an expert kind of agrees with the perspective that the affirmative or negative is taken, whatever side you are, then that would be a good risk for the judge to take. That would be a good thing for the judge to latch onto. Other examples of the kind of evidence that you could read. You could read evidence about the precautionary principle. You could read evidence that we shouldn't take an action unless we can prove that it won't hurt the environment, or that we can prove that it won't hurt oppressed people. And so the judge's appetite for risk should be shaped by that principle. The judge should be willing to take risks if doing so protects a vulnerable population or protects the environment. You can read evidence about existential risk and the relative importance of existential threats versus non-existential threats. Most of you just take this for granted and assert that every impact causes extinction and that extinction is big. You don't really debate it. If you are interested in a lengthy discussion of that, there is a lecture that I have online called Debating Existential Risk. At the same time, you can read evidence about the importance of systemic harms. You can read evidence about the importance of perspective taking or standpoint assessments of harms. Pervasive systemic injuries or pervasive systemic rights abuses or impacts on quality of life might be more urgent and might be more important than catastrophic conflict. Got time for a couple cards. All right. An example of a card that's from some people who are experts in risk assessment who defend the idea that extinction level impacts are most important. Most of you are probably, I don't know if most of you, some of you are probably familiar with this card. Sandberg et al. In 2008. But I want to read it so that we can talk about why this card is useful. The facts are sobering. More than 99.9% of species that have ever existed on Earth have gone extinct. The probability of any one event killing off our species is very low, but as improbable as these events are, measures to reduce their probability can still be worthwhile. While an extinction-level asteroid impact is very unlikely, its improbability is outweighed by its potential death toll. Humanity is still threatened by the possibility of a global thermonuclear war and a resulting nuclear winter. Such remote risks may seem academic in a world plagued by immediate problems such as global poverty, HIV, and climate change. But as intimidating as these problems are, they do not threaten human existence. A nuclear war imperils all of our descendants for as long as there will be humans. We are talking about some 500 trillion people yet to come. The stakes are 1 million times greater for extinction than for the more modest nuclear wars that kill only hundreds of millions of people. There are many other possible measures of the potential loss, including culture and science, the evolutionary history of the planet, and the significance of the lives of all of our ancestors who contributed to the future of their descendants. Extinction is the undoing of the human enterprise. There is a discontinuity between risks that threaten 10% or even 99% of humanity and those that threaten 100%. For disasters killing less than all humanity, there is a good chance that the species could recover. If we value future human generations, then reducing extinction risks should dominate our considerations. So that's a pretty good card. We could obviously highlight that to be real short, but the point is that this is expert testimony about what appetite for risk a judge should have and what risks judges should consider most pressing or most urgent. And this particular piece of evidence comes down on the side of extinction level threats being more important, being more pressing. And so a piece of evidence like this could help you convince the judge that their appetite for non-existential risks should be extremely high. They should be very happy to take risks and to risk catastrophic big impacts that aren't existential in order to reduce existential risk. And so introducing evidence like this in the debate can help you shape the way that the judge understands and evaluates impacts. Here's one for not necessarily the other side, but kind of an opposite kind of argument. This evidence is written by a communication professor and a debate coach who are writing about relative risk analysis in debate and kind of come down on the opposite side. We need to realize that some risks are so trivial that they are simply not meaningful. This is not to argue that all low probability, high impact arguments should be ignored, but rather to suggest that there is a point beneath which probabilities are meaningless. The problem with low probability arguments in debate is that they have taken on a life of their own. Debate judges routinely accept minimal risks, which would be summarily dismissed by business and political leaders. While it has been argued that our leaders should take these risks more seriously, we believe that many judges err in assessing any weight to such speculative arguments. The solution is to recognize that there is a line beyond which probability is not meaningfully evaluated. We do not believe it is possible to conclude, given current evidence and formats of debate, that a plan might cause a 1 in 10,000 increase in the risk of nuclear conflagration. Even if it were possible, we need to recognize that at some point a risk becomes so small that it should be ignored. If both of those pieces of evidence had been read in a debate, there could be a vigorous, vibrant debate about which impact should be prioritized. And there have been topics where a debate like that has happened a lot. The space topic a few years ago was a good example of that, because it seemed like more of a topical question. But in most debates, neither side introduces either of these pieces of evidence or either of these arguments, and instead just kind of takes for granted that there is some objective appetite for risk and then hopes that the judge will just decide to vote for them. Reading evidence to shape the judge's risk appetite can substantially increase the persuasiveness of your risk comparisons, and it can help you shape the debate such that if you win the risk assessment, you can win the debate without getting a whole bunch of the details right on other parts of the debate. So, number 1, taste for risk. Number 2, debate the texture of risk. Debate the texture of risk. Take a momentary breather. Stand over here. Very warm. All right. Texture. So what does texture mean? Normally when we hear about texture, we're talking about like the texture of my shirt, or the texture of this in case, or the texture of the water bottle, or whatever. The dictionary definition of texture, the one that I like, is the 4th out of 5, which is an essential or characteristic quality, essence. So when Würzburger uses the word texture, he's describing an impact's essential or characteristic quality, or its essence, the essence of the risk. The goal of debating the texture of risk is to add sophistication to your scripts. It's to add sophistication to those things that right now you would just kind of rotely repeat. I guess that's redundant. That you would just repeat from the Holy Trinity. So magnitude, our impact is bigger. Probability, our impact is faster, or is more likely. Time frame, our impact is faster. Turns case, if our impact happened, who cares about theirs? The goal of debating the texture of risk is to add sophistication to those scripts, get rid of those kind of silly, basic, novice scripts, and develop a series of scripts that better suit your arguments and that advance risk assessment beyond the basic. The same way that most of you advance beyond the stock issues if you learn debate in a stock issues place, or beyond kind of debating in front of lay judges if you're from an area like that. Most of you here are trying to get to the level where you can debate in front of expert judges. And the same way that you move beyond that, I would encourage you to try to move beyond the basics and impact comparison. So the basic premise of this, and the first thing that I will say, is that the goal of this, or the process that I would encourage you to take, is to first make an argument. First make an argument, then figure out how to best express it. And in particular, to express it with a clear, flowable label. I can't emphasize this enough, but I will attempt to do so anyway. First, make an argument. Then, figure out how to best express it. The Holy Trinity of impact calculus gets it backwards. You try to map your argument to the script that already exists, which doesn't make any sense. And which is the reason that I find those rote scripts so shallow. They lack nuance, they lack depth, they don't get at the essence of the argument that we are trying to make. And remember, essence is the whole idea behind texture. That's why we want texture. So let's start with magnitude. We've already gotten some suggestions about how to split up magnitude. Bostrom suggests splitting it up a little bit into 2 things. But you should think about what magnitude means. So when you want to say that your impact has the biggest magnitude, what does that mean? It means your impact is big? What does big mean? Bigger than what? How do we define big? Why do we care about big? Some language to consider incorporating. Scope. That's Bostrom's thing. How many people are affected? How many people are affected? A lot of your magnitude arguments would be better expressed through the language of scope. Because your argument isn't that your impact is bigger, it's that your impact is broader, it affects more people. When you say a global war between the United States and Russia is bigger than an environmental catastrophe in the Caribbean, you don't mean that it's bigger, really, because the warrant for why it's bigger is just that it's broader. And so what you really mean is that it's broader and affects more people. Next is intensity, or severity, which we learned from Bostrom, or depth. They all basically mean the same thing, which is how bad is the effect. That doesn't really have anything to do with bigness or size. It's about how bad it is. So when you compare, again, we'll use the same comparison, a nuclear war between the United States and Russia to the ecosystem collapse of the Caribbean caused by an oil spill, your argument might be that the nuclear war is bigger. The explanation for that argument might be that it's broader in scope, it affects more people, and that it's more intense. People die as a direct consequence of that war. Whereas with an oil spill, it's unlikely that very many people would die. Most of the destruction is environmental. So while it would suck very badly, it doesn't suck as much as a nuclear war. So even if you only wanted to improve your impact comparison slightly, splitting up magnitude would be an awesome first step into scope and intensity, or scope and severity, or scope and depth. Because it will enable you to better make magnitude comparisons. Because sometimes one impact scope is bigger or broader, but the other impact is more intense. Global warming might cause total devastation to a city on the coast. That city will be gone. But it might provide food for a whole lot of people in India. Because CO2 agriculture is true, which it's not. But comparing those impacts, it can't be big. That's not the word. That doesn't make sense. That's not the true comparison we're making. We're making a comparison between catastrophe for New Orleans or catastrophe for whatever coastal city we're talking about, Miami, versus broad improvements in food availability for a giant country like India. Which one's bigger? Well, you have to debate that. You can't just assert it. The language of magnitude is unhelpful. Duration. I like this one. How long will the impact last? Is this a temporary, short-term impact, or is this a very long-term thing? Sometimes the reason your impact is so important is because it's going to happen for a really long time, like oppression or totalitarianism, or the deprivation, there's the word. Deprivation of basic rights over a really long term, like generations. Your argument about why your impact has a greater magnitude isn't really about it. It's not bigger. It's hard to fit that. Big, is that big? I mean, it seems big, but it's not like, I can't describe that as big, but it's important. And the reason it's important is that it has long-term effects. And the scope could be, small, it could be regional or local, it could be broad, whatever. But we need another word, we need another concept to make that argument admissible, to be able to make that argument. And a lot of times we want to make that argument. Duration, try that one. Reversibility. This is the one that latched on the last time I did this. So some of you probably have heard people say reversibility. I'm not sure that I invented that, but certainly a bunch of the kids started using that right away. I'm sure someone else has said the word before. But why not use that a lot? That seems like it's exactly what you're talking about. Some impacts can be recovered from, some can be reversed, and some cannot. You know, economic decline might undermine growth and cause poverty, but that could be reversed. The economy could get going again, jobs could be created, poverty could decrease, standard of living could go up. It's a reversible impact. Miami drowning in the ocean because of global warming, probably not reversible. It's unlikely that the climate will shift and the ocean will retract or whatever the word is, and then Miami will be there again. Hooray, Miami. Is that like about being big? I don't know. I mean, sort of, right? It's like kind of like, okay, well, it's reversal, so bigger, big. That doesn't feel right. You know, that's not the right word. But it does have to do with importance, with which impacts that we should care more about. How about adaptability? Adaptability. Is it possible to adapt to this impact? Or is this impact something that can't be dealt with or whatever? Survived. Survived is the wrong one, but can't think of another thing. Adapted to. Sometimes the reason that an impact is more important is that it's just totally intolerable for that impact to happen. Oppression, rights violations, totalitarianism, that kind of thing. Colonialism, racism, sexism, homophobia or heterosexism. Think about how to explain that those impacts are bigger. Bigger, just doesn't that seem like the wrong word? It's not that they're bigger. It's that they're just kind of unacceptable. We can't adapt to that. You can't adapt to racism. If you adapt to racism, you're just accepting racism. It's reversible, hopefully. Racism or rights violations or oppression. At some point that could be reversed, hopefully. So maybe it's a reversible impact, but it's probably not an adaptable impact. Maybe global warming is not a reversible impact, but it is an adaptable impact. Maybe the people of Miami can pack up their things and move to, can't think of a city in Florida that's not on the coast, to Georgia. They can move to Georgia. Move to whatever's in the middle of Florida. I don't think there's anything there. Presumably there's something. Maybe the people of Charleston can move up to Columbia, South Carolina. It would suck, but we can adapt. We can adapt to a different geography. But maybe it's not reversible. So then, we have to think about, when we're making arguments, maybe the thing we're really talking about is we can't reverse this, so we got to prioritize fixing this problem, because if that problem happens and we allow it to happen, we can't fix it. But then the other team's like, well, understandable, but even though we can't fix it, we can adapt to it. Whereas the impact we're talking about might be able to be reversed, but that would be really difficult, and we can't adapt. We just can't tolerate that impact. How do you do that only using the language of magnitude? I have no idea. You can't. How do you do that only using the language of big? We're not talking about bigness. We're not talking about like girth or size. That's not what magnitude means. But that's what the script has taught you. Think about what argument you're trying to make about the relative importance of your impact. And think about how to express that. And these are just some suggestions. Let's talk about probability. I've already previewed some of my thoughts about this, and I'm not going to rehash that, which is that probability sometimes it serves double duty, and when we think about probability, we're thinking about different things. We're thinking both about the probability of the scenario and the probability of the impact. But even the language of probability and likeliness demands more nuance. Likely in what sense? Likely compared to what? Likely compared to what? Is my biggest lesson about probability. You should explain risks relatively or comparatively. You know, there is some risk of X in the status quo, and that risk is either increased or decreased as a result of the decision that is made. It is extremely rare that a risk is yes-no, that a risk is totally controlled by a single decision. Another Würzburger card, which got me thinking, and I think is great. A common error is to identify risk-taking exclusively and incorrectly with active policy choices. Passive, stick-in-the-mud policies may also entail risk-taking by attempting to preserve the status quo and ignoring a need for initiative and change. There are no risk-free choices, including the decision not to decide. Even though decision makers often equate passivity with risk avoidance, avoiding active decisions may in some cases entail more risk than making an active choice. The choice is not between risk-taking and risk avoidance, but between different types of risks. As I said, risk is not a yes-no question. Risk is always. There's always risk. And there are always a multitude of risks. And most risks, and I would say all, but presumably there is some risk that is an exception, are not entirely affected by any one decision. Let's do a debate example first. Think about the oil spill's advantage to the Cuba firm. And think about the risk that we are comparing when we think about the oil spill's advantage. Right now, Caribbean Ocean, there is some risk of a catastrophic oil spill. I don't know what that risk is, but we could think about what that risk is. You know, how much risk is there now that there will be an oil spill in the Caribbean caused by anything? Just the general chance that there is an oil spill in the Caribbean. Think about that. I don't know what the answer is, but we could try to figure it out through research and through evidence. That risk might be increased or decreased by the plan, by cooperating with Cuba to facilitate safe oil drilling. The relative risk of an oil spill in the Caribbean changes somewhat based on the decision to do the plan or to stick with the status quo, but it's never eliminated. Maybe there's a 5% chance of an oil spill in the Caribbean now, and there's a 3% chance after the plan passes, after the plan is implemented. In magnitude times probability, Holy Trinity impact calculus, debaters think to themselves, oh, that's only a 2% change. That's nothing. 2% is nothing. Who cares about 2%? But think about that. If we could reduce the risk of an oil spill in the Caribbean by 2%, wouldn't we want to do that? Wouldn't that be a pretty big deal? There's a 5% chance now. Maybe we can decrease it by a couple percent. That would be good. Let's do that. Think about when you make decisions in your daily life. So you might be thinking, when you're choosing your course schedule, you're picking your junior classes or your senior classes, whatever. You've got a bunch of choices, and you're like, all right, do I take AP English or do I take regular English? You could say, well, if I take AP English, I got a better shot at getting into the college I want to go to. Let's say I want to go to Georgetown. Take AP English, and I got a better shot of going to Georgetown. Your ability to go to Georgetown is not wholly dictated by your decision about whether to take AP English. AP English might have a relatively small impact on your chances of getting into Georgetown, but you can think about it, right? Let's say you have a, I don't know, Carly probably knows this, what's the admission percentage at Georgetown? It's pretty low, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like, give me a number, like 10?
Yeah, it's pretty low.
10%. Let's say you have a 10% chance. Just, of all the applicants, you figure I'm pretty in the range of Georgetown, I got a similar GPA to their average, I got a similar SAT to their average, I'm in the range. 10%. 10% of those kids get in. So I got a 10% shot. If I take AP English, and I do a good job, maybe I boost my chance by 0.5%. I could be persuaded that that's true, or maybe even 1%. I get better at writing. I demonstrate that I'm taking the hardest class. I might be able to get some AP credit. It'll help a little. So maybe that chance moves from 10% to 11%. None of you are like, screw it, it's only 1%.
18.1.
18? Ooh, it's a little higher, okay. So it goes from 18 to 19 or whatever. That 1% chance increase in your shot at Georgetown, if that's the school you really want to go to, is super meaningful to you. That's a risk that you take extremely seriously. Right? You think carefully about whether to take that class. And you weigh that increased shot of getting into Georgetown, the school you really want to go to, against the disadvantage, which is like, AP is harder. I'm already taking AP chemistry. I'm already taking, AP music or whatever class I'm taking. Taking AP history. It's going to be a lot of work. It's going to maybe, I want to have as much time to spend with my friends. I want to have as much time to work on debate. But those impacts too are not yes/no questions. It's not like, well, if I decide to do AP English, got to quit debate and never see my friends again. It's like, on an average week, I get 10 hours of fun time with my friends. That might have to change to 9 hours, 9.5 hours. Or maybe English is a hard subject, so maybe it's only 8 hours. So 2 hours a week with my friends. That's not that much, right? That's super meaningful to you, right? When you're thinking about making that decision, the 2 hours that you don't get to spend with your friends, that matters to you. Or the hour less a week that you spend on debate, or the 2 hours less a week that you spend on debate. Too many impacts comparisons in debate do not acknowledge that we're talking about small relative risks, even in the most extreme situations. Comprehensive immigration reform might meaningfully reduce the chance that the United States economy stagnates. That might be true. But the question is not between yes, strong economy, and no economic devastation, and it all hinges only on the passage of comprehensive immigration reform. That's stupid. It's not just stupid, it's like embarrassingly stupid. It's unrealistic. It demonstrates just basic flaws in thinking. It baffles me that so many students get trained to think like that. That every important risk is wholly determined by the next big issue or by the next decision. So instead of framing risk as a yes/no question, frame your risk assessments relatively. Figure out what you think a relative risk is in the status quo, and then talk about how the plan or the decision facing the judge increases or decreases that risk. And then talk about why that's important. And for those of you who are like, oh, that's hard. Batterman, stop making it hard. I'm just going to say that without comprehensive immigration reform, there will be extinction for sure, and if it does pass, there will never be extinction. And that's just, I'm going to do that. It's easy. You're an idiot. Okay? Because that can fly in the JV division, and that can fly in the 3-3, 4-2 debates at tournaments, but that's not going to fly at the highest levels. And more importantly, that's not intellectually honest. And it's not. Why would you be proud to engage in an activity that teaches you to think like that? It's stupid. It's like actually stupid. The dictionary definition of stupid. When you have a conversation with a friend or a parent or a counselor when you're making an important decision about where to go to college, I hope that you don't utilize the kind of thinking that the traditional holy trinity of impact calculus gives you. If I go to Georgetown, all good forever. If I don't go to Georgetown, hell. That's not what it's like. Georgetown might give you a little bit better access to Washington, D.C. and to those opportunities. It might give you, a little bit better friend community because you know some more people there. But if you go to the other school, it's a relatively minor risk, and that school might present better options. It's not so awful hot. It's in a smaller school. There's a more tight-knit community or something like that. I don't know, whatever the comparison is. But you always intuitively understand that there's a context to your decision. And you make those arguments persuasive every day. You make those arguments persuasive every time you make a decision. You persuade yourself, you persuade your friends, you persuade your parents, you persuade your debate coach about which tournament to go to or which app to read. And you should stop checking your brain at the door of the debate round and reverting to totalizing impact claims. Weigh risk comparatively. I'll clue you into a hint. This is how judges evaluate risk. Some judges don't quite get it, and they just evaluate the risks and just add like 90% to every relative risk. But ultimately, the comparison is still between relatively equal risk distinctions. It's between a relatively similar change in risk associated with the DA and a relatively similar risk distinction associated with the advantage, or with the impact to the K versus the case, or the impact to fairness versus the impact to education on conditionality, or whatever. The decision the judge makes is in an environment where risks are generally small, the differences in risks are generally small, and we need to make them meaningful and convince the judge to pick our risk. Next point. Conceptualize time frame as a component of probability, not as a separate thing. The Holy Trinity is weird because the Holy Trinity really privileges the first two parts. They're not equal. Probability and magnitude range, time frame is a thing that people mention but doesn't ultimately become determinative very often. I would encourage you to think about time frame as the answer to the question, is this issue or is this impact imminent? And to use the language of urgency. Urgency. Is this the most urgent priority? Which risks should be addressed first? Which risks should be addressed before addressing other risks? Given the reality that we face so many competing risks, which one is the one that we need to be like, ooh, urgent? There are ways to debate time frame that are not totally stupid. There are ways that aren't just, and time frame, our impact happens faster because it's about the legislation, which will pass tomorrow, except if you do the plan, it'll pass never. Economic decline will happen immediately. There are worker shortages. If only we had comprehensive immigration reform, tomorrow we'd have an economic boom. The immigrants would somehow magically materialize into the United States, start new companies which develop innovative technology, create a bunch of jobs, and start the next boom of the American economy. That's dumb. The reason that you should conceptualize time frame not as when does the event occur, but instead as a metric for assessing probability is because the time frame with which we make our predictions affects the veracity of those predictions. This is the confidence component that Würzburger introduces. Try these scripts on for size. If you're trying to defend a more short-term impact, an impact that is likely to be more urgent than another, say near is more predictable than far. Our short-term impact can be more reliably projected, and there are fewer opportunities for intervening variables. That is a probability argument. That is not a reason you have won. It is not a reason to choose your impact. It is a reason to choose your impact, but it's not a reason to choose your impact by itself. If you want to defend a longer-term impact, make a similar argument, but that comes to the opposite conclusion. Far trumps near. Cognitive biases systematically undervalue long-term impacts. Accepting the risk now postpones action until irreversible. We have these debates all the time. The debate about global warming is this debate. Global warming's effects are starting to happen now, but even people who think that warming is a huge deal and that it's an urgent priority accept and understand that the worst effects of global warming are many years to come, decades or even hundreds of years to come. When debating those people, the people who say don't act on warming now, wait, or don't act on warming ever, say we can't compromise the economy in the short term. We have to make sure that we maintain the economy now. We can't compromise the economy just to solve some problem that's hundreds of years away, or even in the worst situation, 50 years away. Who knows what will happen in 50 years? Maybe the climate will shift. Maybe we'll develop different technologies that can reduce the impact. Maybe we can adapt. And the warming people, the people that are, that President Obama, when he delivered his speech here at Georgetown, the counterclaim is we can't keep waiting because at some point we will have waited so long that there's nothing we can do. And so by prioritizing the economy in the short term, we have doomed ourselves to catastrophic warming in the long term. This is a debate that should happen in your high school debates. Not just about warming in the economy, but about a whole host of impacts. but it's not served by the Holy Trinity. The Holy Trinity does not facilitate nuanced, intelligent discussions about competing priorities and about the urgency with which we deal with different threats. Urgency, priority, near and far, not time frame, the bill passes tomorrow. A couple more. Turns case. Turns case. So this is not part of the Holy Trinity of impact calculus, but it's often plugged in. So you start the you're giving a 1 in our in politics. Our disset outweighs and turns the case. Subpoint A is magnitude. Our impact is bigger. Subpoint B is probability. Our impact is more likely. Subpoint C is time frame. Our impact happens faster. It's a perception link, so we don't have to win our disad. And it turns the case because if our impact happened, why would we care about their impact? Our impact is very big. Oh, by the way, there would be no money to pay for the plan, so it would be rolled back. This will turn into an automatic win in the 2 and R. We're really good at debate. I'm glad that you don't say you're really good at debate, because you aren't. That's terrible. The language of turns case is powerful, but it also means a variety of things. And it means different things. Instead of just relying on the old, tired turns case, if there's a nuclear war, who cares about the economy? Or if there's a nuclear war, who cares about the environment? Or if there's a nuclear war, we can't pay for the plan, we'll be distracted by dying from a nuclear war, which is just dumb. Make an argument. Be specific. How does your impact affect their impact? Sometimes turns case actually means that the impact the affirmative has identified is more likely if we pass the plan than if we stick with the status quo or choose a counterplan. Sometimes it means that there is an alternate causality to the plan. So while the affirmative addresses one cause of the harm, there's another cause of the harm that the affirmative doesn't address, and so therefore they can't reduce the risk of their impact. Sometimes it means that the affirmative can't solve their impact because there is some barrier to solvency that is created by adopting the plan. Sometimes it doesn't really mean anything. It has nothing to do with the case, and it's just a way to explain that your impact exists. Nuclear war turns the case because we'd all die in a nuclear war. Well, that's not turns the case. That's nothing. That's not an argument. So when you're thinking about how to present these arguments, think about how does your impact affect their impact, and in particular, here are 3 suggestions about language. You can suggest that your impact accesses their impact and use the language of access. Sometimes that's what you mean. Comprehensive immigration reform is a great way to boost U.S.-Latin American relations. So if we stick with the status quo and comprehensive immigration reform passes, U.S.-Latin American relations will be helped. The risk associated with that impact will be reduced. So we're fine sticking with the status quo. We don't need the plan. It's like your impact is not intrinsic to your decision. We could make the decision, the other decision, and still resolve that risk. Complicates. Our impact complicates their impact. If we stick with the status quo, comprehensive immigration reform will pass, and that's going to help U.S.-Latin American relations. If we do the plan, comprehensive immigration reform won't pass. And so while they might be right that if comprehensive immigration reform passes, then U.S.-Cuban oil cooperation will facilitate U.S.-Latin American relations, they are wrong that if no immigration reform, cooperation with Cuba will resolve U.S.-Latin American relations. So if our dissat is true, their case is not. We have complicated their impact. You could say that our dissat turns case CIR LA rels. But that's not an argument. You want to say that your impact complicates their impact. Or your impact interacts with their impact, and use the language of interactivity. Interactions. Maybe comprehensive immigration reform builds goodwill among Latin American countries, which complicates, I guess this is a weird one because this would be also the name dissat, this complicates the way that the pink tide dissat understands the spread of socialism in Latin America. If comprehensive immigration reform passes, and it builds positive connections between the United States and the nations of Latin America, because their people are immigrating to the United States, and it resolves an issue of contention, then the socialist message of Castro and Maduro and the rest of the Chavismo folk is not as persuasive. So there is less risk of the spread of pink tide. Your impact interacts with their impact. Just imagine that there's like a pink tide advantage or something. But again, be specific. Make arguments, figure out what your argument is, and then develop language to communicate it. Don't try to fit an argument into the script that you've already been handed. The script that you've already been handed is for novices. The script that you've already been handed impoverishes your ability to make arguments. The final thing is add layers. Add layers. Most decisions about relative risk are complicated. They are not simple. They are not straightforward. They are not easy. They are hard. As are many decisions that you have to make in life. The decision about whether to take that AP English class, that's hard. The decision about whether to go to Georgetown or whether to go to Northwestern or whether to go to Georgia Tech or whatever school you want to go to, that's a hard decision. And you don't make that decision based on a single comparison or on a single reason. You don't say, well, maybe some of you do. Karthik, I guess. You don't make the decision, US News and World Report says this one's 15 and this one's 20, so 15. Got it.
It was 12.
12, whatever. You don't make the decision. You say, all right, well, on the one hand, there's the ranking issue. On another hand, there's the quality of the department. On another hand, there's where it is. There's another hand, there's how comfortable I am on the campus. On another hand, there's the opportunities that it provides extracurricularly, Washington or Chicago, which field is better, whatever. But there are different layers to your decision. Ultimately, you have to decide which one is the most important reason to prefer the risk, to avoid the risk that you are talking about as opposed to the risk that they're talking about. But you should layer reasons to prefer. You should layer your assessment of risk. The Holy Trinity gives the illusion of layering. Because the Holy Trinity tells you that you should say biggest, fastest, most probable. You should say all three. So there's three layers there, right? Not really. There are just three distinct, unpersuasive arguments. Instead, you should choose the one that is strongest and start with that. Find the way to compare the two risks that best privileges your position, that's the most sensible, reasonable, smartest, well-defended, or defensible reason to prefer your impact to theirs, and then make that argument, and then explain why that metric that you have chosen is the best metric. So maybe the scope of your impact is biggest, that's the clearest and best difference between your impact and their impact. Say, explain that, and then explain why scope is important. And then add a layer. Even if scope isn't the most important concern, even probability demands avoiding this risk. Or the reversibility of their impact cautions avoiding our risk. It's not any different than the layering you do in other parts of the debate. NABE K debaters are great on this on framework. They're like, you don't get an AF. If you get an AF, fiat's illusory, so you don't get fiat. If you get fiat, you don't get any advantages. Even if you get advantages, you have to justify all of your epistemology. Even if you justify all your epistemology, you have to justify your ontology. If you do that, method. If you get the method right, well, then you still have to weigh and our argument functions as a dissonant. Goodness, you've layered a lot of arguments there. Most of those arguments are stupid, but they get the idea right. Start with your best argument, then layer another argument, and maybe lay a third argument. Impact comparison requires the same thing. When comparing relative risks, it's not the easy checkbox magnitude, checkbox probability, checkbox time frame, turns case, rollback. That's not comparison. Add layers to your impact comparison. So, we have talked about the traditional model. We have talked about some of the things that I think are problematic about the traditional model. We have talked about some of the alternative models that exist in the world and how the lessons of those models can be applied to debate. And hopefully, I have persuaded you that attempting to do so is in your best interest. But even if most of this is too hard, or even if you conclude, going back to the Holy Trinity, I would hope that at least you will take away from this lecture that you should not think about the world and your everyday decisions in the way that debate trains you to. I would hope that you would understand that the way that we assess risk in debate is not an intelligent way to govern and make decisions about your life. And to be thoughtful and to be open-minded and to be attentive to the importance of making good decisions and how hard that is and how to do that, and not to port, to use the language that you all use on theory, to not take as portable so much the impact calculus that you have been trained. This is not a reason not to compare impacts. This is not a reason not to make decisions. Clearly there is some merit to considering how big an impact is, how probable it is, and when it happens. But I think that is a very, very shallow understanding of risk comparison. So go forth and do better. And that's all I have. It's very warm, and I'll let you go early, but if anyone, we can have a few minutes of questions, and then we will bounce. So does anyone have a question? Yes, sir.
You mentioned it's acceptable to read evidence to support your claim.
It is certainly acceptable.
What options do you suggest to look up if you aren't sure?
There's a whole host. I mean, just search risk in the context of whatever your impact is. So Boston writes a lot about existential risks. There are a bunch of authors that write about the precautionary principle. It's basically just whatever impact you're thinking about. Research that impact and risk experts that discuss it. So if you're defending warming, find people who have thought about the relative importance of warming and who have written or published things that try to convince others that this is the most urgent priority. You just kind of steal stuff from them. If you're reading a critique, think of the impact that you're isolating or the argument you're isolating. Find an author, maybe it's your main critique author, maybe it's someone else, who talks about the relative importance of that impact, the relative importance of that consideration when making a decision. But most of it is not, most of it is very connected to the research you're already doing. You just find evidence that speaks about risk that's in the context of the impact you're defending. That's a good question. Yes, sir?
So in terms of layering...
All right, can we quiet down? Come on. You're going to get out early, but Arjun has a question. I would really like to answer it. I think his question is going to be very smart, and so the rest of you would benefit from listening to it.
So in terms of layering, the formula is, so you pick a metric to compare between the two impacts, then you justify why that metric should come first,
Exactly.
and then you make an even enough statement about why the next metric that, even if you don't win the first one, you should prefer the second one.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's the same way you would say, our best response to this ad is this. Even if we lose that, this other response still minimizes the risk of this. But the key is, pick the one that's the best reason, and then make an argument that that metric should be the standard, or that that's the best metric for comparing risks. What most of you do is you just suggest that yours meets one metric, but you don't defend the importance of that metric. Or if you do, it's just stupid. It's like, prefer magnitude because it's biggest. Prefer time frame because it happens fastest. And it's just a repeat of the tagline. That's what I want you to get away from. But yes, that's exactly right. Other questions? All right, you all want to get out of here. Peace out. Thank you.